all for coming. This is the first Moving to Design workshop series. This is the culmination right now, and it's a little panel. You've seen some of these folks before. Dan and John both gave a workshop each over the last couple weeks. Reggie Wilson also gave a workshop about a month ago, and I have to give a special shout out to Reggie, who was really instrumental in helping me sort of plan some of this and think through the process of what this might look like and get the first workshop off the ground. And then all of these amazing people who I'm so thrilled to have sitting at the same extended table are wonderful, and thank you so much for all of your time and interest and generosity to be here. I think the format is gonna be a little bit, I need to record this, sorry, hold on. We're gonna do some presentations from each of them about their work and how movement is incorporated into their work. And then we'll have a little chat about all the things that you might be curious about, since almost all of you have participated in at least one workshop, so that's great. How does that sound? Should I add anything? Do you want to start, Mark? You're on the front of the computer. So
all right. Well, let's get that started.
You can use
yeah,
this.
just give me the clicker, and
The left should be.
we need to go back to the beginning. Which is left is. Oops, wrong way. I don't have to give my presentation. See, this is the. We have to. That's the video where it won't go back over. So
Got you.
we'll have to do that one. Yeah. Thank you. Can you hear me, or do I need the mic?
You need the mic.
I do. Okay. All right. I'm Mark De Piazza, and I work as a director and designer and filmmaker and sometimes choreographer. I work a lot currently in music, in interdisciplinary music projects. And that means basically music performance plus some other aspect, theatrical or visual or film or something. Increasingly in the music field, there's this urge to supersede the normal modes of presenting performance, the normal relationship with audience. So it's the left, yes. So for this presentation, I just wanted to talk about one project, which is called Sila. Sila is an Inuit word. It means the breath spirit that animates the world. And this is it's a large-scale environmental work that was composed by John Luther Adams, who's an Alaskan composer. He won the 2014 Pulitzer Prize, and he's known for these large-scale site-specific works. This was a world premiere. It hadn't been done. It was to be performed by 80 musicians, and it would take place in Lincoln Center at the plaza surrounding the reflecting pool. Here's the basic structure of Sila. I'm going to hold this. I'm crazy. So over 70 minutes, the piece climbs through a progression of harmonic clouds. So it's a continual ascent for 70 minutes. To properly create these harmonic clouds, the score subdivides what would normally be a 12-tone scale into hundreds. So there's 1,200 pitches for every octave. That's to accurately tune it. If you look at the score, I won't go into detail how it works, but you can see just in looking at the way it lays out on the page, there is this sort of continual climb that's happening. It's based on math of subdividing frequencies. However, functioning in tandem with this mathematical structure, this harmonic progression, there's also an organic structure that's based entirely on the body and the breath. That is because each of the 80 musicians who would be performing, singers and musicians, they would each produce an alternating cycle of sound and silence that would be based entirely on their own breath rhythm. So the way that you're seeing the bars of music line up on the page, in reality it doesn't happen that way because there's this tension between the organic, the body, and then the math of this. How would this all be held together? Because it's 2014 and this is the way we do it now. Stop. There we go. It's an app. So every one of these musicians has this smartphone app in addition to their score. And they're using this throughout the piece, and it has 3 functions. There is a timer that keeps the whole group in sync because they're spread out over a very large space and tells them when to move in the score. Then there is a tuner which will give them these really difficult 100th tone pitches, which are not ones they're accustomed to hearing. We'll give it to them in their ear so they can hear it and match it. And then there's also it gives them feedback. It will listen to the pitch they're producing and allow them to correct it and tell them if it's right or not right. If this all sounds hard to imagine, it actually was very hard to imagine because that was basically the score, and this information was all that we were starting within the site. And so, this had not been played ever before, hadn't been heard by anybody, including the composer. Nobody knew what it would sound like or how it was going to happen. But we knew the ideas of it, and that's what we had to start working from. Also, since the musicians were going to be coming from all over the country, there was no way to have a full rehearsal until the day of the performance. So everything had to be figured out in advance through testing and prototyping in parts. My role was to design the visual presentation and staging of the work. So it was sort of an amorphous role that encompassed design and also choreography in a sense. I want to focus on one of the most important problems that I had to solve, which was how I could shape the movement and presentation of the 80 bodies of the musicians to create a tangible quality that would influence the way 2,000 or 3,000 audience members would interact with this large public plaza and receive the work. I knew that it was really critical to embody this idea of breath as the central idea of the work, and it had to be embodied in the performance. And it might seem that it would naturally take care of itself. I mean, the musicians are basing their playing on their breath, but that turned out to be actually, in tests we found that that was very unhelpful. So if you imagine someone's producing sound for 7 seconds and then they're resting for 7 seconds, that's a long time to be resting. So here's a, if I can do this. Close. There I got it. Okay, so if you watch this guy, this was one of our early tests. There he just finished playing and now he's going into his rest. And you can see it's, not clear, or there's no real intention in it. Essentially, there's a, no, you can reset it yet. So there's this slackening of attention, slackening of purpose. There's no more purpose in his body. 7 seconds is a long time, so he's doing what any good musician would do, which is take a break, because it's a break. However, I realized that that would, even if you just said to them, all the musicians, no fidgeting, that wouldn't solve the problem either, because they needed to embody some kind of purpose the whole time, collectively, as a group. Also, just the way that, if you take, say, a clarinetist, the way that they would normally take a rest, they would continue to hold their clarinet to their lips. So there would be no visual, if you were looking across a crowd of musicians, you wouldn't see anything indicating that whether they were playing or not playing. So this breath cycle would be invisible. So we needed to make this visible. So this revealed sort of another contradiction, which was just that in order to have the space hold this feeling of breath and meditative rest, the musicians had to not rest the whole time. So they had to have, there had to be sort of a sustained cycle of doing created for them that they would persist in. And that had to be something that was simple, but took their concentration and could be communicated through instructions, because we weren't going to rehearse. So as we continued to visit the plaza, we determined some things about the site. We were going to place the singers in the reflective pool, and they would be moving in there. The percussion was arrayed around the outside of the pool at 16 stations. 16 string players were along this edge of the grove of trees, and the 16 winds and 16 brass were on the sloping lawn of the Lincoln. The audience wrapped all the way around on all sides. So we started, the first time we ever heard any of this played was at a workshop in New Hampshire with students. They weren't the real players for the piece, they were professionals. But watching them play through the percussion part of the piece without any physical instructions, it reinforced my feeling that we needed to codify basically everything, how everything was done, how you pick up a stick, how you move from one instrument to another, etc. I also had these same students be guinea pigs for my movement ideas for the singers in the pool. So we worked outdoors at scale, and it became clear that they needed to have megaphones in order for their voices to carry the distance that they needed to carry. Using the megaphones made their sound very directional, so we found that they needed to pan the sound in order to get it heard across a broader stretch of area. I thought that this also could be used to indicate visually the breath, so the raising and lowering and panning of the megaphone became a repeated cycle for the singers, and a way to that we could see who was breathing when and watch the breath move through the group. The singers, of course, couldn't use stands, so they had to manage three items. They had a score, they had the megaphone, and they had the app. And there was a big risk that the app would, the use of the app could look really bad. We saw that it could look like they were texting or involved in their phone, which is not great performance quality. so I designed these score app holder things that I built for them all, which were I found that by placing the app on their wrist instead of higher in their hand, it abstracted the motions necessary to use the touch screen, and it also kept the app more discreet. The other thing interesting that I discovered sort of by accident after I made these was that by rotating their score, so if their score was printed this way, I rotated it 90 degrees so that it changed the way that they would raise and lower their arm, and so that they would raise their arm more from their shoulder or their back instead of hinging it from their elbow, and it looked a lot more embodied and a lot more natural. Again, these kind of details were, in this sort of a simple thing, were really, really important. So they may sound picky, but they were the things that we were very focused on. So we couldn't really test, sorry, is it? There we go. So we couldn't test the actual movement pattern. There was each of the singers had instructions that would generate a movement pattern in the pool. It would create this expanding semicircle. But we had no opportunity to try that, so we had to just, I had one rehearsal with them, and they could practice their individual movement cycle just in time, and then we had to hope that that would actually create the desired movement pattern. I'd been in the pool, you saw the picture of me earlier, and so I sort of tried it myself, but again, these things weren't sure. Finally, I had to make instructional videos for all of the different plays, and that addressed specifically the playing of all their different instruments and how they would manage manage their sounds and silences, depending on what the physical task of playing was for them. So here's a picture of Sela in performance, and I think that, we had nearly 5,000 people in the two shows, audience members attend the two shows, a lot more at the second one. I think this is from the first one. And that the concentration and that sense of purpose in the musicians did seem to transfer into the audience. There was definitely this calm feeling that came into the plaza. Everybody wanted to sit. I noticed a lot of kids that were sitting very quietly through a 70-minute abstract piece of music. Pretty amazing. And there were 2 pigeons that were flying across the pool, and afterwards, I bring this up just because almost everybody who talked to me about the piece talked about these pigeons. And if you can make a public space in New York City, if you can make people pay attention to pigeons and think that they're beautiful, then I think you've done something. So, anyhow, that's Sela from the air, from the helicopter that came and made a lot of noise in the middle of it. I think that with sound, breath, and bodies, we were able to combine those to retune the experience of the plaza. Thanks.
You had a helicopter?
I wasn't in the helicopter, but I heard it.
So for those of you that just sort of stepped in, we have a panel of makers and creators who have very interesting and diverse ideas about design, movement, and performance. And so we're listening to a little bit of their work before we kind of get into some more discussion. So, Kira,
Switch.
Hi. My name is Kira Appelmans. I am a landscape architect, also a dancer. That's been 10. And I'm also a printmaker. So I'm kind of coming at this movement in design from a lot of different angles. And we'll talk first specifically about how I think my kind of background as a dancer has influenced my work as a landscape architect. There are a lot of people in design who come from a movement background, I have noticed, and I think a lot of that is because in design of the landscape or of buildings, you have an opportunity to choreograph the space that people move through and thus the way they move through the space. So this is a project that I worked on in Bilbao, Spain. It's a park that navigates a very steep drop. So this part of the landscape is 12 meters above, 12 feet. So about however 3 meters above this part. There's a river down on this edge. And so a lot of my design starts to look very flowy and fluid, and I have tried to break that. But I always come back to these very flowy, fluid shapes, and I blame my history as a dancer of, learning to move more gracefully through the world. And so I feel like these shapes that come out of me are these very kind of curvilinear, flow-like shapes, because I'm thinking about how people will move from one point to another point, how to kind of frame a view, and how to move out of that view so that the entire experience is interesting or beautiful or whatever. So one of the things, oh darn, you can't really see this, that for me is very powerful in that experience is the use of topography. So this is a grading plan from the park, and there are a lot of, it's very sculpted. So these are all the high points of hills that are working their way down from this upper area to the lower level. And so the paths are weaving their way through those spaces. So you can kind of see, this is that higher edge, and these paths are working down stairs and then long slopes through these landforms that start to frame your view. this is the Guggenheim, so it's the main draw for this area. So we were really trying to focus people's attention on that as they moved through the landscape. The other thing that's really important in design when you're thinking about movement is the places for people to kind of step out and pull out of those lines of circulation. So creating kind of jetties or places of rest, and it's really an accomplishment if you can make a place of rest where people feel comfortable at night, because that's when those kind of more quiet spaces in a public landscape are the scariest, because it's dark and it's quiet, and so thinking about how you can make them accessible but still public is a really important part of the design kind of structure for me. The other way that I have approached design in my own personal, so that's my work life, and then in my personal life, I've been spending the last 4 years looking at a way to integrate printmaking into the design process. So for those of you who don't know about printmaking, it's etching. The work I do is etching copper plates, and you run them through a press and you get the inverse of your etching on the paper. And historically, printmaking has been used in a very, very controlled way to make botanical etchings, or to make, before we had such easy means of reproduction, to make a work of art that could be reproduced, or even, newspaper etchings or illustrations, book illustrations. For me, I look at printmaking as a way to explore different processes. So looking at scales of time that reach from geologic to seconds. And so looking at printmaking as a way to kind of capture these movements in both the physical landscapes, so the movement of rocks or air or water, in a more visual and fixed way, so that you can start to integrate that into a design process. So these are just some examples. They're some of my favorites. I had splashed water on the plate, and all those little droplets, I just etched them so I could get the energy of that water kind of exploding away from the center point. This one is more kind of ephemeral, kind of still, it's not a landscape, but it starts you thinking about how you could kind of vision a landscape in a different way, and how that might change the way that you thought about moving through it. So as I kind of developed that thinking myself, I started to collage into the prints in ones that seemed to really have a sense of movement, or, some of them are just more playful, because that's kind of how the process of creation works. It's not always a direct line. So this one, it's not like a place where I can imagine this exact thing would happen, but it's definitely, there's an energy in this that you can start to think about incorporating into the work. And so as I got more specific about how that would work, this is actually three-dimensional, so it's a little cooler in person, but looking at the prints and starting to think about how they could start to form space. And so this is a desire to come at design from a different perspective, coming more from looking at it in the landscape architecture world. We design and plan almost exclusively, and so that's looking at it like a map. It gets a little boring because it gets a little graphic designing, and you start to lose that sense of the space and how they hold you or move you, or how they could be different based on different qualities. And so this is my kind of personal exploration of how to break away from that plan view exploration and start to look at space as space rather than space as a map. And I used this a bit in a teaching, or in a class that I taught here for a couple of years, looking at urban design, and the way that movement, so this was a really amazing print that my student made that was looking, she didn't intend for this to happen, but she captured this sense of movement being directed by these kind of hard cuts through the world. And so how things react and change, how flows react and change to these hard kind of infrastructural lines, as an analogy, is a really powerful way to start to look at flows in space. So as I work through this process, a lot of what I do is I go to a place and draw it, but I don't draw what I see, I draw what I hear and I smell and I experience as the kind of flows of people and stuff that are going through the site, so that I'm trying to absorb what is the essence of the place rather than what is just the physical structure of the place. And so these are just some drawings that are looking at the wind and the sounds of wind rattling through these little seed pods, and then the dampness and kind of chill that you feel in a more cave-like space. This was in Texas, so that was a pretty stark contrast to the rest of the landscape. And then I use them to make prints. So I'm taking the movement of the place and turning them into a print, and then using that print as a way to work back into design. So this is a park in Nashville, and this was kind of my site analysis drawing. It was a pretty blank space with a very busy road on one side and a small government subsidized housing development on the other side. So this print I used kind of as my diagram for the space, looking at a more intense zone of movement and then a zone of something that was very calm and very still, and this edge as a zone of conflict. So a place where, you know, the more active elements of the site program would engage with this more passive experience. So I kind of diagrammed that out, and then I translated it into a design for the park. And so this is that kind of more active zone. The program for this came from a workshop with young kids, and so they wanted skateboard parks and places to listen to their iPod and makeout pods, and so all kinds of crazy program. So this is the area, where there are more flows, there are more interactions, and then this is the area that starts to get calm and a little bit more, there's more space for isolation. And so just to kind of put a realistic point on this, this is what the park ended up looking like, because we had to deal with the Tennessee Department of Housing and all kinds of other regulatory bodies, and so it drastically changed from this kind of very experimental place that was much more about movement and interaction and people, and it's now kind of like a glorified walking path. But still about movement, but not quite as interesting as the earlier movement. And so something that for me as a perspective, and something I mentioned to James as we were talking about this panel, was that learning how to work within the bounds of these kind of more mundane structures, to do what you can with them, to take your square box and make it more interesting through this kind of understanding of other elements of space, at least for me as a landscape architect, that's plants and weather and light and sound. To just try to I still think this park is an interesting place, it's just been built. And so it does have some of the qualities of the earlier ideas, or the earlier plan, but it's not quite as interesting. Anyway, that's all.
Hey, so you actually don't need, well, you can put that slide in if you want for now, just it can sit there. So my discipline is theater. I run a theater company called Pig Iron Theater Company, although we're thinking about getting rid of the words theater company because of our interest in expanding what the definition of theater is. I would say a couple things about the work that I've been doing for the past 20 years. I think one is, in my world, as theater gets more and more complicated, people are divided up into departments. The sound designer, the light designer, the set designer, the director, even the director and the writer are divided into their departments, and it's often carefully demarcated what is whose responsibility. But it seems to me that theater is fundamentally a hybrid art form, It's bodies in clothes, moving through space, saying things, breathing. It's crucial that all of these different departments are in constant dialogue. But in the American tradition, there have been lots of walls that come up between those folks talking about it. There's a lot of etiquette about don't. If you are the sound designer, you have nothing to say to the costume designer. There's no venue for you to communicate to the costume designer, and it's not appropriate. But until the costumes make so much noise that they drown out your cricket noise. But otherwise, unless it's a problem like that, you can't speak in a more sophisticated way about creating a total work. The other thing that I've been thinking about over the course of my career, a hero of mine ran a theater company called the Open Theater. Again, an expansive idea. This was 50 years ago that he started it. His name's Joe Chaikin. And in his book, Presence of the Actor, he says, the study of acting, like any other discipline that aims to go to the root, requires a new discipline. And I think what was inspiring to me about that was the idea that as an artist you would keep asking questions and researching your field for your whole life if you're going to develop a new discipline. And I guess it seems to me that many of the artists that we admire in every discipline are in some ways sort of asking the question, well, what is this really? And in my field, I think it's the study of character. Which is the idea that when you are seated in a space and a person comes in front of you, the question emerges, who is that? And that through the course of the performance, you provide some kind of answer to that question, even if you stonewall on that question. This seems like sort of an obvious seems obvious the way you might answer those questions, but I think immediately we're presented with, I'll start with a division between two. So I guess in the 1800s, the discipline of psychology was invented. I don't know if you want to call it a discipline or a technology or a framework or a model. And so since that time, and it's not like it didn't exist before that, there's been a way of conceiving of people as governed by objectives. And in my discipline, in theater, there is a whole theater training about objectives and psychology. And that if you want to make good theater, you figure out what these imaginary people's objectives would be, and bam, that's that. If you can do that at the highest level, then you've got the most sophisticated theater. And I'm a pretty schematic person, so I really wanted that to be true. But I started to notice in my own life that these objectives, these goals, actually didn't explain so much. These desires didn't explain so much of the movement of life. And I think one could look at when somebody walks onto the stage and says, who is that? One could answer about that person's psychology, but one could also answer about that is a body moving in space, that is a sequence of breaths. And I guess my work has been about trying to explore venues within the theater where we can look at character not just through this lens of psychological desires, but also let in the movement of life that creates the movement of life that is bodies moving in space, responding to spaces, breathing in spaces, and all of the desires that really can't be determined just from what you want from another person within the course of a narrative, but also the movement that happens just from the rhythms of space and the rhythms of breath. The work that I wanted to talk about today was an attempt to create a play that would frame just measures of everyday motion and turn that into something which would speak about a big event that people would call a political event. So this was 5 years after the World Trade Center came down. And we were talking a little bit about, and it was, I guess, the Iraq War had happened, and we were talking about how right in the days after that the World Trade Center came down, there was a kind of, there was an undefinable feeling in the air. And there was a grief, and there was kind of a shared grief that then kind of got papered over by the U.S. going to war, and all we could talk about was whether you were for the war or whether you were against the war. And I'm not saying that wasn't worth putting energy into, but there was this other quality of feeling that we started talking about and saying, well, how could we get at that feeling, that lost feeling of grief and awe, I guess, in that moment. And one of the things I started talking about was something that had flashed in my head of, well, it seemed to me that up until that time, evacuation drills were mostly drills. But after that time, evacuation drills, at least for a few years, people treated them a little differently. And I said this image flashed in my mind just of the people going down the stairs and watching the firemen go up. And I wondered if we could make a piece which was just that, just bodies going down the stairs. And I started wondering, well, obviously there were people on the 89th floor who knew this was a big disaster and conflagration, but if you were on the 70th floor, it was probably just a drill for you. I kept replaying in my mind that feeling of, oh, I'm walking downstairs, I have to go down 70 floors, I have to go down 70 floors. And there were a bunch of evacuations in New York City skyscrapers in the months that followed. There were plenty, people made sure they knew how to evacuate, and also there were false alarms. And I sort of couldn't imagine walking down 70 floors of escape stairs. So we made a piece that was really just about people walking downstairs. And then after they walk down the stairs, the firemen start to walk up. And it was really just and then people started to panic as they said, well, this can't be a drill if firemen are walking up and starting to run down. And then we would reset again, just have people walking down, firemen coming up. And over the course of the piece, it embroidered to the point where there was different kinds of falling, both falling down the stairs and falling down on the stage. And I wish I had some video of it, but I couldn't locate it because I'm like I'm not here. So I'll just show a couple of pictures of it. So that's the set right there. This escape stair is designed by Mimi Leon. It's the left one you said? No. And there you can see the whole set. It's really just an architecture at this point. Mimi Leon, who's the set designer who designed this with us, we went through 10, 20 models. And we also got a stair unit and did a bunch of research just trying to figure out, well, okay, this is all the info we've got, and this is supposed to be a play, so we're really just working with measures of people navigating space and time, and how many flights of stairs should we have? Should we have 3 flights that take up the whole take up this whole stage space, and then we watch the people exiting away from us, or do we want to watch? So we just did a whole bunch of exercises where we would place this stair unit in different configurations, and eventually came up with this system whereby people enter from the top. From the top, people enter in profile, then make a turn and come down, another turn, and then they exit facing away from us. And that turned out to be something that we just felt was important for this feeling of farewell, this feeling of memorial that we wanted to make. And then also the entrance coming right into our vision was also important. So those were the only entrances to exits. This was a really tiny space. This was an abandoned movie theater, and so the technology to get up and down and it was, no one could really believe it. There's just a ladder behind there that people would have to climb and then walk down and climb the ladder and walk down, and a fireman's pole. So the firemen actors would walk all the way up, and then they would slide down the fireman's pole in order to continue walking up the back. But I'm so impressed with what Mimi did in terms of volumes and volumes, dimensions here, in terms of the kind of emotional qualities we wanted to create. When all we had to work with was these measures, people tap, 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 walk down to a landing, walk down to another landing, and then either that getting faster or slower. I guess you can see in this one that she made stairways that were 9-inch steps, so that the person's head could see, you could see the landing over there. So the head of one person would line up with the feet of the person on the landing in this endless spiral. Let's see what else. I think I gotta go back. Will I go to the top here? That's close enough. And I think also just what she managed to do by making sure that when we first see people, we just see their heads. I guess you can see that in this one. In this little doorway at the bottom there, that's center stage. Yeah. I think I'll leave it at that for now. Just a little introduction. Turn it over to John.
So I wanted to talk about one project, but I wanted to kind of give it a little bit of a background. I started making work in the 80s here in New York. I'm a choreographer and worked pretty much in kind of production structures and theaters that were all frontal, although many of them were not traditional, or most of them were not traditional for seeing venues. And became really interested, I guess, early on in it never really occurred to me, and I said this in the workshop, that choreography, it felt like that was the organization of energy and time and space. And so the idea that there would be this separate design that would exist in some way, and that we would, I'd hire this person and they'd do that, and we'd kind of dance in front of it, of which there was a big tradition, actually, of artists working in that way, just didn't make any sense to me, because it felt like, oh, this is the same thing. So I think early on I started engaging in that process. I never really worked with other designers other than Light originally, but then kind of got into doing that later myself as well. But I think there was a real resistance to having anything that seemed somehow decorative, and that there was a real kind of a desire to have work that was somehow, where whatever kind of visual design existed in it would somehow be necessary choreographically. So I just wanted to show a little bit from this first piece that I made for larger scenes called Gigantic, that had a lot to do with the body and physical body as container of self, and then various layers of container and shifting kinds of boundaries. So that was expressed in, in this piece in this really simple way. We had these blocks and this rope, kind of very large room that rose through the piece and eventually went away. And these sort of interjections that were vertical from below and vertical from above shifted through the piece. The one thing I wanted to sort of draw us to is later chunk. After all of these things had cleared away, I was thinking, well, what are these boundaries that, all of it was sort of about boundaries that were fluid. So we kind of created this inflatable structure that sat underneath the dance floor. So I was very much interested in, and I'll just play a little bit of this. This idea. Just that something that we had kind of come to assume about the space, we would be surprised when we would dance floor that we thought was really solid and we were ignoring, would somehow become fluid or dynamic in a way. But this is still largely in kind of dealing with design in relationship to a frontal viewpoint. Dance Theater Workshop was an organization that I worked a lot with that has since kind of fused with Bill T. Jones and become New York Live Arts on 19th Street. And in that sort of end of the 90s, in the whole dot-com bubble, they had an idea to demolish the theater that they owned, which was sort of a converted industrial space that had a 4-meter ceiling, and build an actual theater. And so they raised quite a lot of money. They raised over $14 million, which for an organization of its size was kind of unheard of and couldn't have happened at another point in time, I think. But in that process, they designed this whole new building, and one of the things that was kind of unfathomable to me is that, as far as I know, they didn't really talk to any of the artists that had been working there over decades. And by that point, I had done 5 shows, I think, at Dance Theater Workshop. So, they invited me there because I was going to do a season, and I walked in, they were like, yeah, you have to come and see the space, it's so exciting, and so I walked in, and I remember this kind of moment of just being so shocked, because it was like 2002, and all of these people were kind of engaged in thinking about installation performance and the beginning of how dance would exist in all of these different environments, and they had built this, basically a larger version of what they already had, and they had poured concrete and put all the seats into that, facing this proscenium architecture, and I thought, wow, this space is supposed to serve the needs of the next generation, and it's already dead, like it's already based on all of these architectural assumptions that people had already been questioning, not the least of which, like, how is it going to house work that was proposing all of these questions that we didn't even think about currently. So I decided to kind of try and address that in this project that ended up getting called Just Two Dancers. And one of the things that I did was I was like, well, what if everybody was seated in this seat that was bolted to the floor looking at this space and nothing in the performance actually really happened there. I installed all of these platforms over the existing seating in a kind of matrix so that we could move from one to another. And then pretty quickly I was like, well, okay, so nobody can see us because we're going to be dancing behind them, so what do we do about that? And what do we do about fracturing it? And it was a duet, so I decided, like, oh, what would it be like if I gave everybody a hand mirror that was like, a 3x5 mirror. And so that became a way of kind of composing a vision of the piece, because sometimes there was a dancer, one of us was behind you and one would be in front, so there was a kind of, so I should try and find a photograph here. But here you can see some of the documentation that was photographic documentation, and you see this fragment of like some other image that in this one happened to be some other audience member, but you cannot put it in there. Okay. This this is not the original venue, but here you can kind of get a sense of this configuration of these small platforms that go over audience seating. And there's another. There's a kind of idea. So what was interesting to me about this project was, and why I wanted to talk about it. No, I don't. Well, I thought I had video here. This is also the way that the space was actually dressed, and kind of this lace that created a forced perspective into this stage space. This was a tour venue. This was not what we originally filmed. But I was kind of interested in all of the assumptions that were embedded in proscenium architecture about important space and space that was adjacent that was supposed to be ignored. So that if James started to unwrap a candy here, he'd somehow be a distraction if I'm trying to look at some performance over there. So, and it felt like there was all of this kind of came together, and it was also 2003, so it was sort of right in the middle of the Iraq War, and all of this stuff that I felt like, oh, and the media is so involved in shifting our attention in the same kind of a way. Like there was a media architecture that felt really obvious to me about how what we thought was important was being directed by how information was being transmitted to us. And so it felt really interesting to me, the relationship between design and architectural design and media design and all of these different designs that were somehow focusing our attention. It was interesting to me to try and somehow address that through how the project. So that was an example of a project. Also, other thing that I wanted to say, up until then, I had really used improvisation in making work, but never really in performance. And a big kind of signature of what I was doing really incorporated a kind of refined notion of like architectural design in bodies and how visually that kind of unfolded through sequences. But one of the things really early on about this piece, by giving this person a mirror, I'm like, oh wow, like the thing that I actually really know how to do. I've set up a situation where the visual design of it is I'm completely out. It's totally out of my control. So, because everybody is looking at an object from a completely different way, and what they do with the mirror totally reshapes their vision. So the piece kind of emerged. Then it was like, oh, this has to be about transmission of information from these two dancers. So it turned into like the design proposal, in a way, reshaped the entire way that I thought about making the piece, and basically moved it into the structured improvisation where we had modalities of how we would work with one another, but sort of being aware that, oh, that thing that I kind of knew how to do, I've kind of given it over to all the audience members to control it much more than I'm controlling it. And so that, in a way, I think, became a really interesting way of actually shifting my own practice. I thought I had video, but I don't. So, I think I've got on that.
Yeah, we can get back to vision more.
There could be other things that I could talk about. I did want to mention that happened. Let me just show this one photo. This was a piece that happened, and I'll say just to say that how like circumstance and that reshapes design and reshapes performance concept. I had been invited to then go back and do another piece at BAM, and after this project, I also did a project where I had the audience lying on air mattresses on the ground, and it was a format with only like 45 performers at the same time, so the dance happened in and around and over people. So it was about all the different ways that you could experience experience dance in a way without actually necessarily ever being able to see it all. So then being invited to do another piece at the Harvey, I was just like, well, why the hell am I doing a piece in the proscenium theater, which led to this kind of question of like, I have to address that architecture in some way in the piece, and then that led to thinking about class systems that are embedded in proscenium theaters through different ticket pricings. And so the long story short, there was a very large idea of a performance that I never actually made because it became too complicated, which was about 3 different performances happening in the same theater at the same time, each of which had a different kind of economic or socioeconomic, like aesthetic coding to them, and that they would sort of interact spatially there would be different stages that were, you know, in the cheapest seats in the balcony and one in the mid-price seats, and then there would be one on stage, and there would also be this relationship between the world-class ballet company and the contemporary dance and either like street theater or some kind of improvisational theater. All of which had been up to that point, like these practices that I was engaged in. And that kind of collapsed because trying to get a ballet company involved became way too complicated, but what stayed was this idea of like, oh, money, and how money affected my own practice. And I was thinking about the fact that having tried to engage in design and basically having no money, I was always trying to mask how cheap the work actually was, or not really reveal it in some kind of a way, not make it look that way. And then I thought, oh, what would it be like if I just set this like concept in the front end of the piece that nothing that you saw on stage could be purchased, so that we couldn't spend any money on it, so that any material or costume or anything visually that was there on the stage had to be found, borrowed, or stolen. And that would determine kind of like the visual environment, but still trying to somehow create spectacle with what was basically trash. And so I just wanted to bring up that because this is an example, that's a photo from the piece. I don't know if it's...
So that's a giant mobile of trash?
We had like multiple curtains of these hangers that came in, and there's another photo that we did quite a lot with plastic bottles, and there was a lot of garbage. And one of the things that I would say is also because my work up until that point had been so clean, like I was always really organizing space and light and whatnot in very clean ways, and even the movement had a kind of precision to it, that then this kind of moving backwards from the context into the politics and then thinking about the design structure in relationship to that really opened up a space, interestingly enough, in the body, because I was like, oh, and this is all kinds of ideas about effort and showing effort and stress. It invited a whole different way of using the body, because I started to think, oh, well, I'm doing the same thing in how I never, there's this whole tradition in dance, I'm never really trying to show the effort. I mean, the most extreme of it in classical ballet, where you have something that, physically requires a particular kind of thing, but it's supposed to be ethereal and floating. So I don't think it was that extreme, but in a way, like, thinking about these design elements actually changed something really visibly about how I was thinking about making movement. So now I definitely like that.
As in Twitter.
Hello, my name is Bill Shannon, and I am a street performer and a skateboarder and a breakdancer, and just a general interdisciplinary artist. I brought some video clips with me to just kind of share how I felt my dancing on modified rock bottom crutches emulates some of the practice of architecture. When you dance on crutches, you have two rigid metal frames that really don't bend. You can't change them organically. They are what they are, and so you end up coming up with a lot of solutions to that around the relationship between those lines and the organic form that you're draping over it. So I also, just want to start with this video, which is kind of a viral music video of RJD2, but a lot of my dancing, coming from the street, born there in the 80s, in the hip-hop era, applying a sort of a radical relationship to urban architecture coming out of the skateboarder ethos, and kind of hybridizing that with lifetime use of crutches for non-weight bearing bilaterally in the hip. So I invented a whole movement, vocabulary around the manipulation of the crutches in combination with my legs. In other words, I can walk, but I can't take a walk, sort of thing. Kind of like having glasses, you can still see when you take them off, but your vision is blurry. When I walk, walking is blurry. So this combination, this hybrid of skateboarding, breakdancing, while representing, the use of crutches for disability and recreation, has led me to a kind of a long-term relationship with street architecture, with signposts, with walls, with cracks in the sidewalk, the quality of pavement. There's a front side wall ride, then I come around and carve around a post, and just that little narrow space, and then these interactions with random pedestrians is also part of the work as well. So, what you're seeing is I still walked on crutches from 5 to 12. I got off of them, learned how to skateboard and breakdance. In the 20s, my hips started to feel really have a lot of pain again, so I reintroduced crutches into my practice. And that led me to all of these kind of different categories of movement. So what you're seeing here is sort of like a very entertaining, just a dynamic performance in the street. All of these people in their actions are improv. And the vocabulary of the technique of dancing, which came out of playing as a child. So when you're a young child, you don't think of crutches as some sort of bad thing. You just say, oh wow, okay, I have these now, what am I going to do? And so, it became a very playful form. Now, once you start doing this type of movement in the street, what happens is you start to have interactions with people that are based on the collision course. And I started this performance series called Regarding the Fall in 1994. And that series basically led me into this questioning of different assumptions that are made in public around the human form and its relationship to architecture, and also representations of disability versus the representation of like a skater ethos. So people are like, yeah, you're throwing yourself downstairs, of course people are going to give you a lot of attention. So I said, okay, well what I'm going to do is just perform simple utilitarian tasks in public space. Now this is no garage Russia, so there's a high intensity babushkas there. But in general, it's this pressure, this unspoken relationship in space. So, I wasn't really trying to alarm anyone, I was just trying to kind of go through space and see and harvest these interactions. So, what that evolved into was an exploration of audience, because, people were like, well, Bill, you have a hidden camera, of course, you're tricking these people, and, it's like jackass, and, why are you doing this poor babushkas, you're being mean. And I said, well, this is how my life really is. I'm just performing a parallel to my real life. So I started to name things like this is peripheral fluctuation, when someone, people are staring, but when you look toward them, they turn away. But that's not that's just one event, but when it happens cumulatively over time, you begin to recognize it not as that individual doing that, but rather as a phenomenon. And so I started naming all the phenomena that I was experiencing in the street based on the nature of them. So I have a whole world of vocabulary around these sociological interactions based on assumptions and my own performance and my strategies, performance strategies. For example, neutral palette is a performance strategy in which I try to not be really extremely in trouble, but not also be extremely heroic. So I have these very ambiguous, I'm trying to ride this gray line in between the two. So here, what you see here is the wall saw. You saw that before as like an entertaining freeze just in the music video that you saw, but this one is a much more kind of strange pausing. And you can see these interactions with people, But again, I'm hugging the wall, I'm using the space, and this is the street, laying down in the street. Why? Somebody on crutches is laying in the street in Chicago? Well, that's pretty normal, actually. You see disabled people in the street, mainly veterans. Why are disabled veterans in the street? Well, because capitalism sucks. In any case, so you see this, like, I'm sort of combining waving and hugging, and these are the type of people that I will have these interactions with. I mean, this guy was circling me for the longest time, so I extended my hand to him. Now, who is he? Well, he's that homeless veteran. He's that person in the street who wants to see. He sees me, and the first thing he says to me, is like, "Are you okay? Are you all right? You don't look so good." And that's, we could listen to the whole thing, but I don't have the time to go through that. But so my dancing became like not only this cascading sequence of references to both my vocabulary and the use of walls and stairs and rails and doors, but it also became about audience. Where is my audience? How can I give people my real street? How can I have these interactions without undermining the authenticity of my relationship to this individual who wants to engage me in a very honest, real way? So he's hugging me. He says in the end, it could have been me. And then this is the audience on the bus here. And what they're seeing is basically uninterrupted by the trappings of the proscenium. In other words, I recreated the proscenium, so I'm wearing a microphone here, so everybody on the bus can hear me. And then we also have a DJ on the bus, so the DJ, which is way back here, I think you can see him setting up, in the beginning. Here we are getting on the bus. Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago, but we also had monitors, so there were people with cameras, so no matter where you're sitting on the bus, you could see what was happening. And then we had the DJ playing music for the people on the bus, but also I could hear the music. So the people on the bus saw me dancing to the music, and we had this personal, very private, very theatrical relationship while we were rolling through the street together. And that was really critical to solving that initial problem of, I'm doing this hidden video. Well, that's not fair. It's not fair. So I said, well, where can I put my audience? Where can I put them? And so then I said, well, let's put them in a window. So I had this trilogy of performances called Window, Bench, Traffic, and here is the Manhattan version of Window. So this is like, where Occupy took over the park there. Well, right before that happened, this is after September 11th, I set up a performance where people were able to look out the window and see me interacting with traffic from a bird's eye view. So again, it was the same idea. We had the same recreation of the intimacy of theater through technology so that you could observe a transient-specific, as opposed to site-specific street performance. So traffic was transient-specific, and the reason I say transient-specific is because my performances happen over blocks, city blocks. They don't happen in one place, they happen over entire city blocks. So you can see here our one and only James Clotfelter manning the tech over the park here. And we had the whole park, so we were circling around this entire block. And I had my dancers that I work with are the Step Fiends. These guys are actual street dance. We actually hang together in the club. We smoke weed and we dance all night. So I had them come into like my own art practice and kind of try to get them. And I had gone through already 4 performances in the theater, actually in proscenium setups, attempting to bring street dance to the stage. And part of this whole series was also my answer to that, which was that, really, I don't believe that hip-hop dance and urban dance really can happily or effectively exist in theater and stay true to its roots and the way that I felt. So, this was a way for me to get around audience. So, back to the architecture element of myself being an interdisciplinary performance artist, I started to also explore how, the sort of geometry of the body and how to rebuild it, to reimagine it, to fragment. So this first one was just building the actual video components. This is like a 7-channel video projection sculpture that I created, and then I attached it to live cameras and started working with non-dancers. This girl is actually a martial artist and a massage therapist, and like a felon, like she's amazing. And she is performing for this video and a live audience, but I was basically looking at rebuilding the body in this fragmented sort of form. So that it's almost like a cubist approach. So all these cameras are surrounding her and kind of giving us different angles of her body in real time. And you can kind of see a little bit of her silhouette here, which is featured as well. So when you come into the space, you know, you're able to experience this sort of body being in different places in your imagination. It's, you know, depending on how you want to look at it. You can look through it at her, you can look at the surface of the video, you can look at her shadow and her, you know, and all, or try to look at them all together. And so, you know, the body as a actual sculptural form, you know, a dancer recreating themselves in real time, in real space, and how that ties into my own imagination of how I like to dance, how I perform, and how I try to present work. So that's like basically one small window into my work. Thank you.
Pretty exciting. Yeah, so you can see why I brought all these people together in the same meeting. There's an undeniable force of questioning and intention here. So the reason that I put this together was because I was moving between programs and these two paradigms of design thinking. One being transdisciplinary design, which is I think an incredibly interesting and emerging practice of looking at complexity and using tactics that many people bring from specific disciplines and trying to break down those borders, questioning the practice, questioning the system, and then finding new proposals that can start to address problems that are no longer singularly living in discipline. And then I began this program in the architecture school with lighting design, and I found a very different structure of practice that, from my perspective, was much more traditional, but was also asking us to question design as a process or question design as an intention. But between them, I felt like there were many gaps, and my background is in performance and working with all of these people here, and I think the question is what started to propose this, and this is what I feel like I'm seeing in a lot of this work is a questioning of the architecture or a questioning of the public space, a questioning of engagement. And there's different, like I think, very intentional philosophies about what we want to see emerge or what we're interested in dealing with. I think in the city or in the landscape, we see a lot of privileging of mobility and less of an opportunity for rest, contemplative space, but then these theaters are facilities for specifically rest. But then within that structure, there's a new sort of battle. So I guess I'd like to start kind of by asking a little bit about how you rehearse this intentional argument against the structures that you see that are not suitable. I think we've talked a little bit about in our conversations about objects as the extension of the body, so I get really interested in, Dan, when you talk about the rehearsing these stairs and the pacing of steps, and demonstrating different opportunities for getting to the core of what that movement is, and I think here when you're talking about how the park was a bummer because it ended up as a glorified sidewalk, is because it circumvented this intention about the intercirculation spaces, and so and I think Bill also demonstrates a lot of this like object as the extension of body as he's incorporating all the physicality around it. So I don't know, it's a huge question, and I feel like it's something that is shared, and in a design program, or as a design, we don't have a lot of opportunities to rehearse. So I guess I'm curious what your thoughts on rehearsing these kind of more principled and deeper sort of struggles looks like for people that don't practice rehearsal as much. Is that a crazy?
I mean, I feel get support for those street performances where you have a bus rolling through the city with an audience on it, on skateboarding through traffic. I mean, the insurance, the traffic control, the local police, the city government. I mean, it was a nightmare, and that's the kind of thing where I am just so impatient. I just want to have my audience have a real experience. I don't care. I don't really want or have the time or energy to deal with the logistics behind it to the point where I just, back away. It's like, I don't really want to do that. Even deal with them at all. The granting, proscenium-based, a lot of that is like, what do you mean? How do we get our numbers? Where are the people at? Well, the people are in the street, and I don't know who they are, and I don't have any guarantees that anybody is gonna be there. So that's my own feeling. Like I just got to the point where after that performance series, I started getting into the video sculpture because I just wanted to have an intimate, something that I was able to build on my own resources with some funding, but not like the $30,000 you need to like really do something. You know what I mean? So that's my response. It doesn't exist for me anymore.
So when you're developing your relationship with the audience, and you found that, because when I started working with you, we were doing the proscenium space.
But you saw, how difficult that was. I mean, I was using real street dances, and people didn't even, like we dance in a circle. So even to change their mind from dancing in a circle to dancing half of the circle and opening it up, it just doesn't translate very well.
And the bus was
an answer to that. It was an escape into like, okay, well, let's try to do this, but then it just was a nightmare in terms of logistics. Yeah, so, I mean, I look at their work and the amount of just infrastructure involved and all of the planning people that you have to deal with. I mean, I just want to jump out a window. That's what I get to the point where I get to.
I guess it's a little bit of the.
It takes a certain person to really make it, those big projects. And I have a tremendous amount of respect for people able to do it.
How's the infrastructure at the Lincoln Center?
It's tedious and it's Byzantine. There's like all these little fiefdoms that control every different thing, and they don't necessarily communicate with each other. So you just have to talk to make sure that you've spoken to everyone about everything.
Did you find that it was it had to become a new collaborative process?
There were a lot of compromises that are just because of them. Obviously, I think dealing with any kind of big organization. I think that I brought up that project because it was not because it's typical of what I do, but just because it seemed especially appropriate to this conversation. But I think the kinds of interactions with my discipline sort of falls between the cracks because I was a dancer for a long time. I started in filmmaking and design. I don't really, when I list all the things that I do, it's more because I can't really say any one of them is where I fit. So I have a similar issue with like trying to fund my work, or unless I like jump on a project that exists, it's hard for me to even have a category that I can apply under for most grants and stuff, because I don't fit any of them. I'm not really a choreographer. I'm not really a theater director. I'm not really, but I do all those things. So I think that, yes, frustrating interactions with bureaucracies and institutions is, I'm familiar with it. It's a skill.
Yeah, it happens at a whole different scale. When you're designing a real fixed infrastructure like a landscape. But part of what I think is so nice about, Phil actually saw your World Trade Center one way back.
You mean,
I saw the one.
the park?
Yeah.
Oh, you saw it? Oh, awesome.
Yeah, and what is so nice about, I think especially New York, but the fact that in a lot of cities, people are taking on public space as a place for performance, is that when you design a space, let me go back. When you're performing, the performers, for the most part, have an idea about how they're going to move through their space, be it a stage or be it separating people, you're bringing them together, and the people moving through the space, it's kind of the improvisation of life that activates that place. And so to have something come in that is choreographed to activate that space or engage that space in a new way and change the experience of the people for whom it has become mundane is really special, and especially when it happens on a sidewalk where everyone's just like, oh, I gotta go home, whatever, go to the store. It's kind of a magical moment in that realm of kind of very functional, measured. You were talking about the dimensioning of space. So in that space that's become very utilitarian, to activate that as a performance space I think it brings people out of their everyday life and does something that you get in the theater, which is that kind of cathartic release of like, oh wow, that was an amazing experience. It brings that to your life. This is making me want to go back and become a performer again in this conversation. So anyway.
I think it's, in performance there is this inherent given about the unknown. And I think as much as you try to, you spoke about with the mirrors, and I think we are always aware of that, and that's one of the things probably why it's always so interesting, because as much as you craft and sculpt, you know that there's going to be something that is in the shift. And that is, I think that's partly why I'm interested in what rehearsal looks like in that context versus something that has more longevity, like in some of these constructed environments that we are proposing. And so when you're dealing with things on a big scale, like John and Danny had these massive sets that really do contemplate architecture and where it is housed, sort of the relationship between those two proposals. What does that rehearsal feel like in the early stages of the design process?
I mean, I make dance in a very particular kind of way, which I feel like is probably really quite old-fashioned. I spend a lot of time like really looking at movement and trying to be very specific about movement. I mean, Mark actually, I don't want any, no, but I don't know I don't know what to say about that other than to say that's kind of what it was a big part of my interest in dancing and dance making, so that has stayed. Even when I'm dealing with improvisation, I feel like I have a really long process of wanting to kind of examine the embodiment of it. And then there's this big question, because we can never usually, in the 90s I had a loft in Bushwick before anybody ever wanted to live in Bushwick. So once people started to want to live in Bushwick, it was too expensive and we got thrown out. But when it was a total urban wasteland, I was able to do certain kind of work that engaged design because I could do some version of it and put it in my studio, and nobody else used my studio. You know, that ended, and when that ended, I think it really changed how I could engage with design. And I do know, like I have colleagues who, and I can think of one colleague in particular who really wants to do these, they're always a huge installation in the show. And right now, in my sort of experience, I'm like, okay, well, you know, I don't really want to do that in the same kind of a way. In part because I just sort of think like I have to think about the economic ecology of the dance world. So even if I had those resources, I'm like, I don't know that I necessarily want to put them as much in that way. And you know, all these people who have developed all these skills and spent all of this time working with me, they still get paid shit. So to me, and I keep struggling to try and keep it, you know, where it is and not make it decrease even further. So to me, that becomes more of an issue of like wanting to deal with it in that kind of a way. And then then trying to find a design interaction that is potent and powerful, but at the same time really recognizes an economy of means. That becomes more and more important. And I don't know if that answers your question somewhat about like the rehearsal process, because to me the rehearsal process is the place where we're kind of living in the thing. I can't work in a way where it's like about ideas. It has to be about embodied experience. And that just takes time, and time costs a lot of money.
You know, I sort of want to answer your question sideways too. It's normally, and I bet this is the same for most people, you talk to your peers, you talk a lot of inside baseball, you talk like, oh yeah, did you see that this happened? And so it's kind of a great opportunity and daunting to be on a panel with these folks with other kinds of artists, and then I actually don't quite know who my audience is here. It's like, well, I guess they'll be designers and architects. What am I supposed to say about the work that I do? Like, maybe they don't care at all about the theater and what it does. And I was like, well, if I was going to have the courage of my convictions, I would say, well, I think my work is really just about a desire to just say, wake up. I really just think that's all that it is. And this is the tools that I arrived at through a mixture of taste and class and what happened and education, but probably looking for like surrogate dads when I was 15 and falling in with like theater clowns and things like that. And that's, but I guess I see a virtue in that, and sitting on the panel with these artists who I'm like quite in awe of the work that you guys have done. At the risk of putting words in your mouths, I do hear that being voiced by all of us, that there is a desire to say, wake up. Just a desire within your forms to shape just a little bit and say, okay, but it doesn't have to, you don't have to repeat mindlessly the things that have come before. I mean, I see that in how you evaluate Bill's interventions, that you wake people up in that moment and allow them to see things. And I guess what I don't know, James, in terms of your question about can you rehearse, is what does rehearsal look like? I guess rehearsal, when you think of your art practice as a kind of research, it's just like, well, let's try something that we don't quite know how to do and develop a vocabulary from scratch. I assume the reason you asked us all here is just to sort of say, well, there's other ways of looking at things. Don't just fall into people who are your kind of people. I guess seeing both drama and our lives as rhythmic, I guess the funny thing about it is there's just so many rhythms that creep in about there's so many ways that people go to sleep. And I even hear it also in the struggles with bureaucracy that everybody said. I mean, I got a really lovely, coveted residency at Bridgenkopf Art Center this past week, and I was like, oh, can we borrow a dolly? And we're gonna like put people in on the dolly. But I knew the answer was gonna be no. Because of insurance. No, I was like, if this is a dance floor, I was like, that, having ruined the dance floor at Dance Theater Workshop. Yeah, oops. I've ruined enough dance floors now to say, I understand now that you can't do these things. I understand that you don't want to gouge a dolly, but they weren't concerned about the floor, they were just concerned about liability. So it was also kind of like a no, you know, it was like a not awake. It was a not awake. That's the problem with the bureaucracy. That's the skill that you develop. It's like, hey, I want to do something a little bit different, and yeah, nobody can answer that question. You know, when my theater company gets a residency at a regional theater or something, I'm like, just so you know, someone's going to ask questions,
that like nobody's asked before. I'm like, ha, 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 ha. You know, like can we put platforms over the seats and stuff like that? Like, I don't know. That's not allowed. I mean, I don't even know whose department is that. Because the seats, I mean, and
Oh,
they're,
I've been in, you know, I did a piece of, I was a resident artist, I was there to make a piece at a very well regarded university, and I wanted to, and I was like, oh, they have a hydraulic, and I was kind of like, you know, I want to use it, and he's like, whoa, well, you're not to use the hydraulic pit, and then we're going to have to put stanchions on the edge of the stage so that the actors don't fall off of the stage. Like I'm like, I mean, it's a stage. I mean, it was one of these unbelievable moments where I was like, are we really having this conversation? And finally I got them to agree that, okay, it was okay that the orchestra pit was down. And I'm like, what do you do when you do a musical? Like, do you put a rope across the front of the stage? But it was a conversation that went on for, you know, a week and a half. So, I don't know. That whole conversation reminds me, you know, I know Bill Forsythe, who was a very famous choreographer, and he was the director of a very large ballet company, Ballet Frankfurt. And they did this really contemporary work, and when he came to Frankfurt, it was just like a city opera that was not, and the opera company remains completely conservative. So he was working in this really big structure that was not designed to do any kind of crazy, weird, strange thing. And I thought, you know, looking at his career and knowing him a bit, think, you know, the thing that he was really brilliant at was not create. It was not so much, and I know that sounds really weird, but what he was just a master at was to get this behemoth machine that was completely not willing to do any of this stuff, to do it. So, I mean, in a way, that it felt like that was kind of genius design, was to sort of like figure out how to work the machine in a way that it didn't know that it was about to do something that it really did not want to do.
What's interesting about that is that he is, you know, he's working in Germany. He's an American, but all that work was in Germany, and he was living in that machine and working in that machine, which is an opportunity that a lot of us never get. You know, you get a week at Baryshnikov Center. You don't get to be there all the time making your work with a tech staff, with a, you know, with a shop, with all these things. Like that just doesn't really happen, you know, almost for anyone. And that, just going back to your question about rehearsal, I think it's really interesting. For me, like one of the project I talked about, one of the most difficult things about it was really there was no rehearsal, and like that's not the way that I'm used to working. So, because usually I'm used to learning through, you know, embodied learning, because the things you learn are surprising when you actually are in a room trying things, and you don't learn the things you expect. You may test the things that you wanted to test, but you don't often end up doing those things. You end up doing something else that you stumbled on by accident in the time that you're working. So, you know, for me, like I now will design sets and things like that, and that is one of the most difficult things about that process for me, is the time where I'm just sitting looking at my computer screen or something like that and thinking, like, well, what is that like? And will I even like it? And how will that feel? So, like, I remember your studio in Bushwick, and I think, I mean, didn't you build sets there too? And you could actually design a set by building it, which is a great way to design a set.
It's funny, I think what I was trying to say was that at a certain scale, there is no rehearsal anymore. For an artist of my level, there is no rehearsal after I reach a certain point. I just don't have the resources, the insurance, the support. So it just becomes, if I want to go that far, I just have to say, this is going to be it. And whatever happens, happens, and it's a snowball, and we're just all going to ride with it, and it's just going to be what it's going to be, and that's it. There's no stopping.
That's funny because I was thinking of this guy we're talking about. When you design, you do iterate, so you go through lots of different options and you think about what is this going to look like, how is it going to work. Then at a certain point, it's just like you just build it, and sometimes you say, oops, I wish this was a dress rehearsal, but it's not. And so it's interesting because
I'm excited to hear sort of like this reflection of rehearsal, because we don't often have rehearsal in the studio, and so it's, I think personal history becomes the best teacher and the best instructor for how to move forward. So
Yeah, I have a question, and this may be something we're talking about rehearsal, but first of all, this is amazing, so exciting. So most of your work is performance, so it's a set period of time, and people either willingly go into it or not necessarily willingly, but it's there's a set period of time. So it's heightened experience for that time. So what you then were saying about that all you want to do is say wake up. So for us that are designing space and keeping more longevity, it's there as opposed to it's there. I'm curious, do you have any thoughts about that, about how the work you do might translate into that, something that is just going to be there?
Well, I don't think, nothing just is there. I mean, like, it always kind of weird to me to think, like, you know, architecture is a time-based form, you know, and decay happens, and all kind of, like, what actually it is only what it is because somebody is in it. So how it changes over short periods of time, how it changes because of energetic flows, what this room is when we leave it is different than it is right now. So to me, I think that, you know, thinking about all of those things, you know, I mean, I hate to be, it's all about the American program, but, you know, it is kind of like what's going to happen with that environment, because it just isn't a thing separate from the experience of it. It becomes what it is and takes on meaning for people and wakes them up or puts them to sleep because of how they inhabit it. So I guess the question to me is like, what are those kinds of questions, and how can you engage in that? I mean, I think what you were saying, I so identify with that. I mean, like, to me, like awakening, like trying to figure out awakening, but it's also like, to me, it's not just like you wake up. It's like me wake up. Like, kind of like, I feel like I make work for that reason, is that otherwise I don't notice things. And so, in some kind of a way, I think that when you were talking about design and rehearsal, like, I was thinking that, yeah, most of my ideas are really dumb and bad, and I try them and I'm like, oh, that sucked. But something else usually, like quite often, something else happens in the doing that then I'm like, well, that wasn't really what I was thinking, but it's much more interesting than where I originally started. So an idea becomes a kind of place of starting, and then to me that brings in this question of improvisation in design. Like, how can you not just think and then project the thing, but like be in a process of like, oh, you make a gesture and then you see it, and you say, okay, well, what is that, and what is it doing, and asking all of those kinds of questions, and then that guiding your process as a designer, even if you're building space. And it seems to me like that's what goes on when you're faced with the urban planning community. It's like, well, no, actually, you can't do that. You have to do X, Y, and Z. So then the question becomes, how do you work that problem? Because to create a process is kind of a puzzle. Like, it's a problem, and then you kind of try and figure out how to solve it in a way that activates something for you.
I think for me, the work that I do that's closest to just being there is film It's something that with performance, even after it's done, you can tweak it, or the performers will change it, or they'll grow into it, or something will happen, or there's this living, ness to it where its identity isn't set. It's an alive thing, and I think that when even in film, there's always this moment when you start editing and you come off of having shot all this stuff, and you have both everything you really did shoot, and then you have the vision of what you think you shot in your mind, and then when you sit down and look at all that, you realize that you just actually have this stuff that you shot, and there's always disappointment with some of these amazing things that they happened, you were there, but somehow the camera didn't see them, and then there's, and then in the process of editing, there's this retooling where you actually that becomes your material, the footage you do have. Maybe your ideas of how you're going to put it together change. Maybe you find something better than you thought you were going to do. But then in the end, when you go back and look at something you did 5 years ago, it's still that thing. Exactly.
Yeah, I feel like I have that. I started, I'm always like changing what I think of myself as an artist, and I started saying conceptual artist because I started to build a lexicon around my performance practice. And that lexicon became more and more involved. Not only like these are the movements and this is how they sequence and everything, like the building the actual body relationship to the form of the crutch and then the different modifications of the crutch, and that became a whole body of language to then talk about the movement. But then the sociological and phenomenological work and the real-time live performance as an exploration into sociology. And so that kind of body of language also started to really solidify to where I began to really identify really clear fields of, and so that's what I think lasted for me in my work. Once I'm gone, no one's going to experience the unique hybrid my life and the time that I grew up brought to this world. And I'm like a product of my time and place. But the ideas that I'm going to record and pass on in the process of doing that are hopefully something that will be inhabited by other people for as long as our language and our culture exists. And that's not space us, I guess. But yeah, so I think that's really the ideas are the one building that doesn't fall. I mean that as long as they are passed from generation to generation, or that culture carries ideas beyond any physical manifestation of what we think we are. So I think that's the ultimate permanent, so the notion of permanent, even that's not permanent, but because it even changes with interpretation, I think. But I would say, yeah, if I were to say one thing.
Well, thank you for indeed an inspiring and interesting panel. I'm trained in architecture, and I work in urban planning, master planning, and a little bit with the United Nations, so more like international development. So these different scales of interacting with space. And I want to say something, and I don't want to sound cynical, but I want to say something that I found really interesting in your work, but I can't, or maybe I'm still struggling with this idea in my head. I want to find like an object for it. And I can see it definitely because you showed the landscape architecture. You talked about machines, so for architects and planners and landscape architects, actually governments, whether local or regional or even international laws, etc., they are the machines that they try to navigate and to work with. And I still find it difficult to understand, why in art there seems to be some kind of anarchy in that sense, while architects and planners, they always have to deal with these structures. They cannot be anarchists, even if they want to, even if they try. And again, I'm not being cynical, I don't see a dead end for that, but that's a real issue for all this. And I don't know if this is really because of the structures themselves or of the capitalist relations that they have to be engaged in production, to make a living. But there seems like this vicious circle of so architects, as you said, you were talking about the hierarchy, the side. So yeah, so you said that he eventually becomes the person who knows how to navigate that machine. And that is the contribution. And for me, I see many architects and planners doing that as their contribution, even though the final product might not be like the design that we aspire for. Or, it's just an idea I'm just grappling with, and just trying to say that can we see also some kind of value in that process itself, and not the final.
In what process?
Like the process of dealing with this machine, like navigating that machine in that sense. Like even the Lincoln Center, the architecture is not only the square plaza,
It's the organization. I just don't think it's so different from what you're describing. I think the anarchy is wishful. It's wishful anarchy. It's not. I think that we all have to deal with these structures, whether we like it or not. I mean, I think it feels like you're the sort of the most outside the box in that way, but I know that like I constantly, there's no way to escape those dealings. They're constant. They actually sometimes I feel like I do more of that than I do the work, which is depressing when it feels like that. But there's a lot of that. So I don't think that especially in theater it's collaborative work. You're working with organizations and lots of people, and you have to deal with it. You're not really, you can't just be like.
But what the main difference is that in art, and I'm trying to think about this, there's an audience which relates to the idea of temporality. So there's there's this idea of there's somebody who's coming to see what you're doing and to interact, and that's an additional layer. For example, in architecture, you can't think of the users as the audience because already in the process, you're dealt with the government, you dealt with the client. There was no audience, and then when you produce that product and finish that process, this is when the users come in. And that's also another interesting layer to, I don't know, again, these are like thoughts.
Don't you think that in dealing with or in thinking about the space and the way it's shaped and clad and the wood in this room and the lights in this room, you are projecting to the audience a certain idea? So you're not engaging the audience, but you are in a very indirect way. I would definitely argue with your assertion that there is no audience, because I think the minute that somebody walks into a space, they are the audience for that space because they're interacting with it. Whether or not that's conscious, it depends on their willingness to be aware of how they are in the world. But I think you have to redefine audience as, for these guys, yes, it is the people sitting in the seats, but for a space, it's the people operating within it and activating it and making it alive. You're kind of the performer and the art and the audience in one.
Rochester Institute of Technology designed their campus to fit in one of people's tank in the hallway between the buildings so they can block the students in.
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of
Examples.
There's lots of examples of campus that were like in the early 70s that were designed specifically to be
Batteries in
viable.
the 60s.
Yeah.
I mean, taking a step up in terms of the disciplines, I think all of us are directing attention towards something. And all of us who craft design, I guess even you craft words, we're like, well, I want to direct your attention towards this. So in that way, it is the same. It seems to me. I guess I'm on my own like mental trip right here. Just hearing Bill talk about his devotion to ideas and coming from as someone with the coolest body who's like done so much body work and I feel so conflicted in I'm such an ideas person. It's almost all I care about, and yet in a way I think of my practice as like I have this idea. Let me get these big fleshy bodies in the room so I can be proved wrong. Like that's what rehearsal is for me. Is like, oh, this is going to go like that, and like, well, okay. So it turns out that these
fleshy bodies do this and this, and they don't go like that. And I guess when I think about like, since you asked, man, like give architects advice. I'm like, wow, because I'm sure like I've definitely been in spaces being like, I wish I could talk to the architect. You know, I mean, definitely we felt that way about theaters, fucking sure, but there's other places too, yeah, I guess I see this amazing ability our species has to imagine ideals and lines and geometry is so fantastic, and yet we then can also forget the scale of the human body and of breath, and so we design these stupid things, both in performance and in architecture and in social systems that are like, well, this is the idea. I mean, this is such a great idea. Like, to me, the one that is current is the whole movement against nutritionism that Michael Pollan is about. That like, oh my God, we did all this science, we figured out what nutrition you need. It's gonna be amazing. We need these 72 nutrients, we're gonna put it in a pill, we're gonna do baby formula, amazing. We don't need milk anymore. And then it's like, turns out like your perfect science baby formula doesn't account for all the weird fleshy variables, and like babies die from drinking all the formula. That's sort of the example. And then like, I don't know, I feel like you've gathered a bunch of folks who care a lot about fleshy bodies and all of their contradictions and the need to keep contemplating them, and yet I think also, yeah, I guess I see the only hope as being like being willing to engage that schematic idealizing part of the brain that creates systems, and then make sure you alternate that with checking in with fleshy bodies.
I think maybe what the thing you said about like valuing the people who are making that work for those other reasons or those other people. I think it's deciding who your audience is. I mean, I think we all have the people that we want to talk to, you know, and also the thing that we ultimately are wanting to say. And sometimes those power structures or institutions become obstacles on the way to saying the thing that you really want to say to the people that you really want to say it to. You know, James and I just worked on a project which was sort of the first and only commercial project we've ever done. We did this fashion event for Fashion Week for fashion event. So we built this and designed sets and lighting and all this kind of stuff. It was really different for me working in this, you know, client kind of situation where really everything. I felt like it was sort of like trying to make art except with the guts taken out a little bit, because you knew that at some level the end result, like you're still trying to make meanings and you're still trying to communicate, but in the end you're trying to be pleasing in some way, whatever way, whether it's you're going to be edgy pleasing or you're going to be, you know, cool pleasing or you're going to be beautiful pleasing or whatever, but in some way you know that that's the thing, the end result. And it's very calming in a certain way, that it's not, you don't go through the torture of like, you know, what kind of meaning you're trying to make it? Is it stupid? And, you know, is it, you know, it's just like, no, you know, it's a straight line, you know, in some way. You're still solving problems. It's still hard. It's not easy. But it was just interesting for me. I don't know, maybe some of us.
I think it's probably time to wrap up this formal bit. We have some food, so there's some informal chewing and talking. I just really want to thank you guys for being here and for contributing to this. I want to thank Reggie again, and Joy McKinney and Abby Calhoun, who helped navigate some of the insane bureaucracy that is in the architecture of this institution. It was a monster. And for my wife, Kristen, who you will be happy because I think she got cups